Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the publishing workshop with Alexandra Pringle. Thank you so much, Alexandra, for joining us today.
I'm so pleased to be here. You know, this is my 4th LLF, so as you can tell, you can't keep me away. I'm really thrilled to be here today. I just wanted to say that if anyone at the back wants to ask questions later, it might be a good idea to come to some of the seats a bit nearer so that I can see you, because I can't really see any of you in the back.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will be speaking about publishing in general and Alexandra's career also, and we'll be taking you through the publishing process and hopefully benefit from the decades of experience that Alexandra has to offer. And if you have any questions about the process of publishing, specifically if you're in the process of getting published and writing, please feel free to share your questions with us. We will be opening the floor shortly for your questions. Alexandra Pringle was the editor-in-chief of Bloomsbury for 20 years and is now an executive publisher. Among the writers that she has launched and she has worked with include prolific names such as Margaret Atwood, Kamila Shamsi, Khalid Hosseini, and so many more. We will be talking to Alexandra about that and again about the process and how to get published if you're in the process. Alexandra, to begin with, I want to talk about your career particularly. So how did it all begin? What can you tell us about your career and generally about the publishing industry?
Okay. Well, my career didn't begin very auspiciously, because I have to admit to you that at school I read a lot of novels and I didn't study very well for my exams. So I became proficient at failure, and I used to fail exams regularly. And I'm going to admit everything to you here. I failed to get into university when I applied, and I think it was because I was pretending to work when I was at home, and I always had a novel under my desk. But what I didn't understand was that actually what I was doing was training for the rest of my life. And it took me years to look back and see that. So I went to a technical college in Cambridge. It wasn't even a polytechnic. It's I have to admit to you, the lowest of the low of educational establishments. But it was a wonderful place, and there were various writers who were teaching there, poets in particular. And I, at the end of my time there, one of my tutors started a poetry festival in Cambridge and brought in poets from all over the world, including such poets as Miroslav Holub from Czechoslovakia, the Black Mountain poets from America. And I loved being around these writers, and I thought, this is what I want in my life. And I went back home and I was describing it to my family, and my brother said, well, perhaps you have a talent for poetry. And without thinking, I said, no, I have a talent for poets. And I realized that it was writers that I wanted to be with. So I took myself off to Italy, and I taught English in a school in Florence for a year and came back. And I managed to find myself a job on an art magazine, a starter job, which was paid, I can't tell you how little. It was what was £5 a week. This was in 1974 or something. And I had to teach English as a foreign language at nights and weekends in order to survive. But I loved this work and I learned a great deal. But after 2 years, I realized I needed to earn some proper money, not least because I got married for the first time. My other admission is I've been married a few times. And I was married to an artist, and of course artists don't, on the whole, earn money. So I had to earn money. And my boss, who I loved on the art magazine, I said to him, I have to go. I have to find another job. And he said, I live next door to one of the founders of Virago Press, and would you be interested, because they are looking for an assistant, and we could share you. You could do part-time of both. And I said, absolutely. Virago had just been set up. So Virago was and is a feminist publishing company, and it was tiny. There were just 3 people working there in a room 5 stories up in a house in Soho between sex shops and amusement arcades. It was in what was then the seediest bit of London. And there were these 3 formidable women And I went for my interview, and I remember I was wearing a shirt and a tie, and which was not because I was a feminist, although I was, but because Annie Hall, the film, which probably none of you know, was very popular at the time. And I got the job as the office assistant, which was the lowest job of all. And I had to type invoices, make tea. My tea was very bad. My boss, Carmen Khalil, told me that I was the worst tea maker. I had to go to the post all the time. I muddled things up a lot. I sent some books to Canada when we didn't have Canadian rights. And that's how you learn in publishing, is that you have to you start from the bottom, and you have to be very patient, and you work your way up. But the thing about Virago was that we were there to change the world. It wasn't about making a huge financial success, although that mattered, because profit does matter. But we were there to make the culture change and for women's lives to change. And it was absolutely inspiring, but also terrifying and the hardest work. And I was at Virago for 12 years. So I started as the office skivvy, and I ended up as editorial director and a part owner of the company, because at one point we were independent, and then we were bought, and we bought ourselves back out again. So I became part of the management team. So I learned everything, but very slowly, because I'm a tortoise in life and I don't hare ahead and succeed quickly. But I cared very, very much. And it was at Virago that I realized that for me, it was the quality of what I was doing mattered to me much more than what I was earning or getting a big status. That for me, it was what you were doing that mattered. So that was the beginning.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. That was really, really inspiring. You spoke about, financial success being an important factor. So I want to expand a little bit on that. We often hear authors talking about ideas that sell and ideas that are commercially viable. I want to know, within the publishing industry, who makes that decision, and to what extent is that a reasonable expectation, and to what extent is that fair on the author who's bringing you a story?
Well, if the publishing company doesn't succeed, no books are published. So it is our duty to authors to make books succeed. But the nature of books is that most of them don't make enough money to keep the company going, and you have to rely on having a few extraordinary successes. What you want is as much of a balance as you can get, but it's very difficult. It's particularly difficult if you work in what we call literary publishing. So publishing is basically general publishing, and I'm not talking about specialist or academic publishing, that's completely different. But general publishing is split into commercial publishing and literary publishing. And commercial publishing is publishing for the mass market. So romances and thrillers and genre publishing is more on the commercial side. And literary is more about the voice and the quality of the prose. And it's very hard to make that publishing work. So you have to attend to the commerce. But of course, what I feel is that in the end, the heart of a publishing company is the editors. I mean, it's really the authors, but within the company, it's the editors. And all an editor has in the end is their own taste. And however much you might try and chase the market and work out what it is that's going to succeed, it comes from right inside you and what you feel about what you've read. And you have to bet on that. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's very difficult to be an editor, because you are really exposed. Many years ago, decisions were made more by the editors than anyone else, but publishing has grown. It's becoming much more corporate in the UK and in America. And I know that's different in Pakistan, where there are a lot of small independent publishers, and I believe in that. I think that is the lifeblood of publishing. But corporate publishing, which has taken over in the West, a lot of the decisions are made as much by the people in the sales department and the marketing and the publicity departments as by the editors. And the editors have to present what they want to those people, and it's really their decision whether you can take it further. So that balance has changed. So in small independent publishers, the decisions are made by the editorial side, but that's not the case with larger publishers. It's changed.
So on that, what are the sort of ideas and stories that publishers are looking for? If you can give us an insider's view on that.
Well, it's very difficult to quantify that. So I'll talk about fiction first of all. And the thing about fiction is it's alchemy. It's really the making of magic. And so it's really hard to pin down or specify what it is, but it's in the voice. And there is something about a voice that sings that makes you attend, that when you read a manuscript, you are rooted to that. You forget the world around you. And it is it is really a kind of magic. So if an author, I always feel that if somebody becomes a writer because they have an idea that it's a great profession, that's the wrong thing to do, particularly with fiction. Real writers write because they have to write, because they have a compulsion to write. And yesterday I did a launch with a British Pakistani writer, Rupa Faruqi, who we published her account of actually being a junior doctor in the pandemic. But she writes novels for children and for adults. And she was coming back from 15-hour shifts in the hospital. She has 4 children, and she'd sit down and she wrote through the night, through the pandemic, because she had to write. And I think that is the most essential thing. But what you're looking for is you're looking for stories, and what the world is looking for in these dark times, a lot of people are reading fantasy books, books that take you into another world and another time. So historical fiction, fantasy fiction. We have had at Bloomsbury the most extraordinary successes recently. One is with a novel called The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, which I published 10 years ago, and it did really well, and it won the Women's Prize. And I fell in love with that book so badly. I was on a train going to Paris with my husband, and my mobile phone lost its battery, so I had to grab my husband's, and I said, if I don't get this book before we get to Paris, I will not be able to have the weekend in Paris, because I wanted it so much. And I was bidding, I was trying to preempt it, and I did get it just before we got into Paris. And I published that book just because I fell badly in love with it. And what was so extraordinary is that 10 years later, it was discovered, I don't know how many of you know of this book, it was discovered on TikTok by teenagers. And people were posting videos of themselves reading it and crying, because it's a love story, and it's a beautiful love story set in ancient Greece. And before Christmas, we reached 1 million copies of The Song of Achilles. That's just a freak. When I was bidding on it in Paris, I was buying it really for myself. And I have to say also my son, who is here today and doing an event, because he was studying classical civilization at university. And that was the world he was interested in. And he and I would go to visit ancient sites in Greece, and we went to Syria, and we went to we went to Palmyra, we went all around looking at classical sites. So it was really just about me, not that I thought that 1 million people were going to read and love the book. And this is just an extraordinary thing that happens. And then there's a very, very young woman who was a student at Oxford University who wrote a fantasy novel. She's called Samantha Shannon, and her first novel was called The Bone Season. I don't read high fantasy at all. I don't understand it. But I loved this book, so I just bought it because I enjoyed it so much. And she recently published a novel called The Priory of the Orange Tree, which is a huge fantasy novel. We've sold, 500,000 copies of that internationally. And that's the strange alchemy of publishing. But I do think that people are looking for escape a lot at the moment. But having said that, there is also a real market, an important market, for people's lives, and particularly people's lives that are hidden. And yesterday I did an event about the memoir, The Go-Between, by Osman Yousafzadeh, and he is a very, very famous fashion designer but he grew up in a completely illiterate home in Birmingham in the 1980s with parents who come from the Pakistan-Afghan border, and they couldn't speak any English and they couldn't read or write. And he ended up going to get 3 degrees, dress people like Beyonce and Lady Gaga, but he's written a book which is about this extraordinary childhood. So I think that people who have life experiences that are unique and who can express that, and he has told the story of a completely hidden community in Britain that I think will be a classic in many years to come. So I think that, unusual stories and life experiences, but it's very much in the way you express them. It's not, the story is not good enough on its own, it's how you write it.
Absolutely, I agree. Alexandra? You spoke about Madeline Miller, Samantha Shannon. Both these authors and their books are widely read and very, very popular in Pakistan also. I want to know, we were speaking earlier and you said publishing is a bit of a gamble, but you worked with such successful, prolific authors and made them huge successes through your editing and through the work that you've done with them. So do you have, how do you figure out that this is a story that is going to be a success? What are the indicators? I know you said it's a bit of a gamble, but still.
Yeah, you don't know. This is the thing I have to say. It's like when I read the manuscript of Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert, when I was reading it, I kept thinking of all my girlfriends I wanted to give it to read. And I also found myself crying and not even realizing I was crying. But no other publisher in Britain wanted that book, and I bought it for tuppence halfpenny. And it took 4 years. It became a huge success around the world, and then Britain followed. I think it was more successful in India and Pakistan than it was in Britain for a long time. And so you don't know. But what you do know is when you find talent. And for example, you said, I published Kamala Shamsi, and her mother and sister are here today. But I remember when I met her, I was doing a creative writing workshop in a university in upstate New York, and I was given a pile of stories, and I have to say they were all terrible. They were really not good at all, but there was one gem of a story, a shining jewel, about a little boy flying a kite on a roof in Pakistan. And this very shy young woman who'd written it came up to me afterwards, and she said, "I think you published my great aunt, Atiya Hussain." And I had, at Virago Press, republished her 2 wonderful classic books in our Virago Modern Classics series. And I remember I gave my card to Kamala and I said, "I think that behind your story is a longer narrative, and you might like to explore that, and let's keep in touch." And I was a literary agent at the time. And so we worked together for 2 years, and then I sold her book to Granta Books just before Atiya died. So it was a really lovely thing that we had this generational passing on that went. And then we worked together ever since. When I joined Bloomsbury, she came with me. But it was only really with her 5th novel that the success started. Everyone was a good novel, but it was quiet and it was sort of sticking with her. And then when Burnt Shadows came in, I remember reading that, and all the hairs on my arms stood up, and I thought, this is it. This is the one. We can fly with this.
That's truly remarkable and wonderful to hear. So you said it takes a lot of time, and it took Kamala Shamsi, her 5th novel, to be, a huge success. So I want to go to the very beginning of the process and talk about the process of publishing a little bit. For the aspiring authors in the audience and everywhere, people who are listening to us, how does it begin? Once, when you're about to approach a publisher, what should an aspiring author or writer have in hand? Should it be a draft, a manuscript? To what extent should that idea be developed for them to actually approach a publisher?
Well, in the UK and in America, you really have to have an agent nowadays. And it is almost impossible to manage without an agent. But it is different in other countries. So if you are approaching either an agent or a publisher, if it is fiction, you need a full manuscript. and not just a full manuscript, but it has to be as good as you can possibly get it. And that means not just writing it and then giving it one draft or two drafts. It means putting it aside for some months, coming back to it. It means also sharing it with people that you trust to give you a real honest opinion, which of course on the whole people can't do because you don't want to hurt an author. You know, it's a very, very difficult thing, but it really helps. Because if you turn in something that is less than the best that you can do, you really haven't got a hope. So I'll go back to fiction, but with non-fiction it's different. It's very much about the subject, what you're writing about, and your expertise. So if, for example, you are writing a history and you have a degree as a historian or you've done a lot of studying, it's about working out what the structure of the book is going to be, what it is you're trying to do, and you need to write a really good synopsis with a chapter breakdown so that you write a page, say a page or 2 pages about what your vision for the book is, who you think is going to read it, what other books are other similar. So that's where the market is important, why your book is different, who you think the book will appeal to. And then you want to try and do a chapter breakdown, and don't worry about it because once you've got the contract, that can all change. You don't have to stick to it, but it just has to convince. And then you need to do some sample chapters. And I think that if you're a first-time writer, you really need to have 2 or 3 minimum to show how you write. And I can't say this enough, how you write matters. Obviously, I'm talking about your style of writing, but that also includes actually your grammar, your punctuation. You need to make the manuscript look as good as it can possibly look. Never, ever turn in a manuscript that's single-spaced because it's exhausting reading a manuscript as opposed to a book, and editors have to read dozens of them. Sometimes you can read 10 a week, you know. So if it's going to put you off, if it's going to be physically difficult to read, you're going to put it aside. So make it look as beautiful as you can. Get a very good font. Times New Roman is a very good font. You know, double space or 1.5 space. Make sure that everything is grammatical, is well spelt, because it's irritating to read something that has illiteracy in it in any form. We can all do it as editors, heavens above. And I used to get 0 out of 20 for spelling tests as a child, but I've become a very good speller. But so, nowadays we have spell check, we have Google, we can check everything, and you just have to spend the time doing it. So it needs to be professional and persuasive. But with a novel, you need the whole thing, and it needs to be the best you can give it.
That's really great, actionable advice that we can definitely follow. Alexandra, so I want to know, once you have a manuscript in hand, you have a literary agent, will they connect you to a publisher?
Yes. They do your dating for you. They're like a dating agency. So, the thing about literary agents is they know the editors, they know the publishing houses, they know their taste, they know the kind of work they do, which is very hard to do if you're a young writer or a first-time writer. The only way that you can do that, and it's really worth doing, is to go into bookshops, pick up books, look at who's published them. Always look at the acknowledgements at the back, because writers acknowledge their agents and their publishers and their editors. And so you can find out. So if you think, I write a little bit like whoever, this is the sort of writing that is a little bit similar to mine, that agent or that publisher will be along the lines of your own taste. But what the agents can do is they do that dating for you. So the agents will send the books to the publishers. If they're really good, they'll ring the publisher up first, the editor, and say, I have a book you're going to love. And they'll tell you why you're going to love it. And they'll get you excited about it, because if you think that an editor, they have to, all day you're working at the process of publishing, because there's a huge amount of work to get a book published. And we do our readings at nights and weekends, and occasionally we'll take a day at home, but it's really hard to find that time because you have so many meetings in the office. So, and you can be sent like 20 manuscripts a week. And you think, what am I going to do? You know, so the agent, if it comes from an agent who you trust, who you have a good relationship with, I'm afraid it will go to the top of your pile. And if it comes from an agent who you don't have that relationship with, it will sit aside, it will take longer. It doesn't mean it won't get to you in the end, but it's a real help. So having a good agent is like, well, it's gold dust. It really is.
Thank you so much for that, Alexandra. So once you have an agent, once you have gotten the contract with the publishing agency, you spoke about that briefly. So what are some of the reasonable demands that writers can negotiate within the contract when it comes to marketing the book or the publicity? Like, what are the technical aspects, if you could expand on that a little bit?
Well, you don't really negotiate that side of it, because your job as the author is to do everything you can to help the publisher publicize the book. So it means that you have to be prepared to do whatever you can. But frankly, if you're in the lucky position of people wanting to interview you, or, you know, give you an event at a festival or whatever, you know, that is only joy, really. And so the only time you have a clause, there's always a clause in a contract saying that the author will make themselves available to do publicity around the time of publication. And if the author has a publisher in America and in the UK, you have to work out, nowadays you really need to publish at the same time. You have to negotiate that, the publishers do it between each other. Who's going to have the author when? And that can get a bit unseemly. But it is your job to do everything you can. And that often includes writing in newspapers, articles that are tied in, just to get your name out. People say that somebody has to hear an author's name or a book's title 5 times before it will go in their head. So it shows you how important publicity is. And of course, now we have social media, and it is, of course, a great thing for a publisher if the author has a high profile on social media. So for everyone who is writing, get yourselves on Instagram and TikTok if you're young, obviously not me, and Twitter. And, you know, it starts very little, but just by creating a community, you build up a community, and that can become very important. And I've watched that. I have a wonderful stepdaughter called Clover Stroud, who has just published her 3rd book, and she writes memoir. And she now has 25,000 followers on Instagram. And she writes very frankly about her life. She has 5 children, lives in chaos. She writes about all her emotions. And her new book is about her sister who died. She had a wonderful sister who owned a circus, was a great artist, and she died 2 years ago. And Clover's written this book, and it's gone to number 9 in the Sunday Times bestseller list. And a lot of that is because she has this devoted following on Instagram. So I'm not saying you all have to do social media. It's not right for everyone. But if you are an outgoing person, you like to share, you have a friendship community, use social media. But Twitter has become very toxic, and keep away from that side of it. But the sort of Instagram, Facebook, TikTok community is really very benign, and it gives you a following. So, you know, that's a real help. But in terms of other contractual aspects, that's your agent's job, is to negotiate you a good contract. And publishing contracts are very regular. The advances, the royalties, it's not rocket science. It's quite straightforward. But as a writer, it's such a help to have an agent. If you don't have an agent, it's really good if you have anybody that you know who is a published writer, to ask them about it and to look at their contracts, to find out what their terms are. But on the whole, I think publishers are reasonably, we're all in it because we love books, and we're not in it to rook writers. And we lose a lot of money publishing books we love a great deal. So, it's not a shark-infested water, I think.
Thank you, Alexandra. So you've published so many incredible names, and we were speaking earlier about Abdurrazak Gurnah. So if you can, talk a little bit more about him.
Well, the happiest moment of my whole publishing life, and actually a happy moment in my entire life, was last October. We were all working at home, and I was online. I was in a meeting, and then it started popping up on my email that my writer Abdulrazak Gurnah had won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And I just burst into tears. I was beside myself, because just after I joined Bloomsbury 23 years ago, one of the very first writers that I took on was Abdulrazak, and he was mid-career. It wasn't his first book, and he had, for a previous book, been shortlisted for the Booker Prize. So he had had, really substantial recognition, but he had been dropped by his publishers, and which happens to people. It's often harder for your fifth, sixth book than it is to get a debut published, because everyone's looking for the exciting new voice. But people are not so thrilled about somebody where the sales have leveled off and they, produce good work, but it, isn't naturally obvious to market. But he's a writer who I felt was really important, because he was one of the first writers to write about refugees, asylum seekers, migration, the winds that blow people across the world, which are not just the winds of war, but they can be economics, they can be family, they can be love, they can be adventure. There are so many different reasons why people will move, will change. My family, my mother's family, were Moroccan traders, and they had caravans that went from Timbuktu to Essaouira. And one of Abdulrazak's novels, Paradise, was about a caravan that went across East Africa. And I feel these stories, I've always felt these stories to be really important. And now, of course, everybody's searching for them. People really want them, and a lot to do with the Black Lives Matter movement, and the culture has shifted, but 20 years ago that was not the case. So I would publish one novel after another, and he'd get some good reviews from some really good people, including Kamala, who was a great supporter of his. But nothing happened, and every year I'd submit his work to the Booker Prize, and I'd think, fingers crossed, and he wouldn't be listed. And then with his recent novel, Afterlives, which I think is one of his great novels, and it came in, and it's this beautiful story set during the First World War and the lead up to the Second World War, about the East African young men who were taken by the German troops and had to fight for Germany. No one knows this bit of colonial history. It was absolutely fascinating. And I thought, this is the one. And then I looked at the Booker Prize judges, and the chair was a woman called Margaret Busby, who is a remarkable woman, she was the first black woman to have her own publishing company in Britain decades ago. And I thought, she will know his work. Black Lives Matter had happened. He is this great African writer who is still undiscovered. This is going to happen. And guess what? He didn't even get on the long list. And I was devastated. And you have to be very robust as a publisher. You have so much disappointment. It's full of disappointment. Your life is full of tragedy in that way. But, you have your amazing successes, but you have lots of failures. But that one was tough for me. It was really tough. None of the other prizes, nothing happened with him. And then in the summer, autumn last year, The Guardian had this huge article saying, reinventing the canon of black literature. And I thought, this is going to have him in it. And it was people like Ben Okri and Bernardine Evaristo writing about the tradition of black writing. Not one person mentioned Abdulrazak's name. And I posted on Instagram and Twitter, like, I have had enough. I had a fit. I'm like to be gracious on social media, but I stamped my foot. And then 4 days later, he won the Nobel Prize. So you can see. And there had been not a whisper. There are always rumors flying around about who's going to win it. Not a whisper this year. So he thought it was a prank call. He got the call from Sweden, and he said, I don't believe you. This is a prank call. And they made him go on the website, and he saw they were just announcing it. He was in his kitchen. He'd made a cup of tea.
That's really remarkable. Thank you so much, Alexandra. After this question, we'll open the floor to questions from the audience, so if we can have a microphone around. So you mentioned about, this being a very tragic work at times because you have to deal with a lot of disappointment as a publisher. And in Pakistan, the publishing industry, because of, the ban on books, on import of books, primarily from India, there are a lot of publishing houses that are being established. So from a publisher's point of view, you led Bloomsbury Publishing for 2 decades. What is underrated advice that you would offer to publishing houses and a lot of women who are leading these publishing houses now in
Which is
Pakistan,
fantastic.
incredible.
I think that is absolutely fantastic, and it's really exciting. I think that small independent publishers are the lifeblood of literature. They are so important, and I think as a writer, to go in with an enterprise like that, you are working together to do something, and you will get a kind of personal care and attention that you don't get in the big corporations. Yes, in the big corporations you can get money thrown at it, you can get big marketing muscle, but in a small company, and I know this from being at Virago, and publishing first novels there and rediscovering forgotten work, that you publish. It's like going to buying a handbag or a shirt that's been handmade, that you get something that you cannot get from a factory made, and that's what you get with independent publishers. And yes, mistakes are made and there are difficulties, but you're in this enterprise together. And I think that, to have independent, and I particularly obviously passionately believe in female publishers. I also think that women, I know it's very hackneyed that we do all our different jobs, but it's like we can lead domestic lives and professional lives together. And in a way, publishing is a bit like that. It's a bit like putting together the domestic and the professional. And you have to do a lot of caring. And I make jokes about #authorcare, but I think looking after your authors is incredibly important. And I think independent publishers look after their authors very well. So, this is the beginning of what will grow into a real flowering of the publishing industry, and perhaps the fact that books are not coming in from India and the difficulties of that will lead to a really bright future in home publishing, and that would be really exciting for Pakistan, I think.
Absolutely. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Hello, I'm Amber. Thank you so much for coming to LLF regularly. It's really nice to see you. And thank you for conducting this session. I just wanted to make a comment about marketing and promotion. These words scare me because what I think is that at times, in your experience, have you seen any writers being scared because, sometimes their work gets lost in translation, in the back and forth between the editors, the agents, the publishers, and then, how much of original content, stays. This is something that I fear as a writer. It looks like a big, bad world out there. So
It's not. The person at the center of it all for you as a writer is your editor. And it has to be a relationship of mutual trust. And I always say when I start editing with a writer that what this is it's a conversation. As the editor, you're not telling someone to do something. What you're doing is helping them make their manuscript into the best thing that it can be. You're there as a midwife. You're not there as a teacher. It's a really different thing. And it always, the sanctity of the author's work is there. So that if an author says to me, this is like this because it needs to be, that matters to me. But in the pushing and pulling, often an author will realize that they need to do something different. We're just publishing a novel which is getting incredible reviews about the Bach and the Making of the Great Passion by a writer called James Runcie. And he got in the first draft of the book, and he's actually given a whole talk at the Edinburgh Festival to 500 people about how tough I've been as his editor. But I said to him, it's not working. It's not working. It's dead at the moment. And I suggested that he told the story from the point of view of a little boy who is in the care of Bach's household. And he had to completely rewrite the book and do it from the eyes of this little boy. And I promise you, it's like sometimes a manuscript comes in and it's stuck on the ground, and then what you want is for it to lift off, and it started to fly. And it was through doing this dramatic thing. I've suggested in the past that the whole tense a book has been written in be changed, that that something that's written in the third person should maybe be written in the first person. But these are just suggestions, and in the end, if you as the author feel this is wrong, then you have to follow, what you feel. So it's about, as an author, taking what is useful to you from what is offered to you. So it's not you're not in opposition, and then the other person is your publicist, is an important person in your life, because if you're asked to do something you're really uncomfortable with, then you need to express that to the publicist. And if you have problems with that, you need to talk to your editor. Your agent is there to help you. But the publicist is trying to do the best for you, to get your book to the most people, to help your book out into the world. And sometimes your publicist might ask you to do something you find difficult or you feel uncomfortable with. But if you trust the publicist and the editor and they say, really, this will help you, it's a good thing to take a deep breath and do it. But if it's something that you find incredibly hard, then that has to be respected too. You see, it's all a negotiation. So don't be frightened. We're all on your side.
Hello. Actually, I have like 2-3 questions. Shall I ask them together or let the others ask questions?
You can ask all of them together.
Oh, okay.
But maybe one at a time,
One
otherwise
at a
I'll
time.
forget them, yeah.
Yeah, I will start with the shorter questions with possible shorter answers. Do editors or publishers consider the geography of a novel that it is set in? For example, I belong to Balochistan, where there are a lot of writers are specifically from Lahore, Punjab, and Karachi. They are published, but from Balochistan, which is the largest province of Pakistan with the history, novels are not set in there. So do editors or publishers consider them that, do they give them the chance that, yes, we can publish this thing?
I think that I don't think publishers really think about geography at all. It's if a book is set somewhere and they do it well and it comes alive, and actually somewhere which is unusual and is not familiar makes it in some ways more attractive than something that you've read about a great deal. So if you're bringing something to the world that is not so known, I think that's a plus. But as I keep saying, it's all in how you do it. If you evoke a time and a place really well. I love reading. I've always published from all over the world because I read to learn. I don't read. I'm not interested in sort of, for me, the kind of middle-class London life. I mean, if it's very well evoked, that's great. But that's why, reading The Kite Runner was incredible because, and not just. People in Britain and around the world have this view of what Afghanistan is like. And what Khaled evoked was this cultivated middle-class life in Kabul, and this wonderful life full of poets and singers and so on. And it was just amazing for me to read about this time in this place, and I thought, thank you for bringing this into my life. It's like it's a way of traveling without traveling, and it's how we read to understand our world, and ourselves too, but the people that we live, the world that we live in, to understand our history. And fiction and memoir, I think, are two very powerful ways of learning, and it's like you absorb it through your pores rather than your head. And you read history, you absorb it through your head, and that's fantastic. So like William Dalrymple's history that we publish is, incredible storytelling, but having all that fact in it. So don't be afraid of, and also write from what you know, because you're going to write better. The more intimately you know about it, the better you will write about it.
Right, thank you so much. My second question is that I was just watching this YouTube video where editors and publishers were talking about the editing and publishing process. And some writers, I don't remember the name, they said that sometimes we may reject manuscripts just by reading like the 2 beginning paragraphs. And if that doesn't strike, then we keep it away. Is this true for you?
No, not 2 paragraphs. But I have to say that because, as I said, you get submitted so many books, the quicker you can hook someone in, the better. But it doesn't have to be. Sometimes it's just something about the quality of the writing, you know, and as you're reading it, you think, this needs a lot of work, but I'm really interested in this voice or this writing. I think that, you know, you usually give something at least a couple of chapters, not 2 paragraphs. That's too little. But this is why I say just make it the best that you can, because we are very time poor. You know, we really are. And I think that it's hard for writers to understand that publishers spend, you know, you get into the office. I used to get into the office at 8 a.m. and leave at 7 p.m. often, having worked straight on through the day, and then go home and do some reading, and you're tired when you're reading as well. And I think it's hard to understand that we have very stressful lives. And so, you know, and if you're given so many manuscripts and you want to do your best, but you're not always at your best, you know?
Right. Thank you. I would ask last questions to let others ask questions. Some publishers or publications, they accept manuscripts online. And then they say they've given their instructions on websites that we will respond to you within 6 months.
Sorry, could you just repeat that last bit?
Some publishers like Penguin online on websites, they accept manuscripts online.
Yes.
Yeah, and then they say that we will respond to you within 6 months.
Yes.
Does that work?
Yeah, we always, every manuscript comes to us, you know, online. We don't, nowadays people don't send physical manuscripts. Those days are over. But it can take a long time to get back because of the sheer volume of submissions. So it can take easily 3 months to get round to reading a manuscript because you have so many. I tend to read manuscripts, we all tend to read manuscripts on our Kindles nowadays, which is great because I used to spend a lot of time going to the osteopath because you'd be, you know, hauling these huge manuscripts around, and now you can sit on the bus and read your Kindle, you can stand at the bus stop and read your Kindle. But it's just sheer volume, so you do have to be very patient. And that's another reason why if you have an agent, it helps because the agent can nudge the publisher and say, you know, where are you? You know, have you thought about this one yet? But it can be a long time. So if they say 6 months, it doesn't mean they're just sitting around eating grapes and drinking whiskey or anything. You know, it's because they've got a lot to do.
Thank you, Alexandra. Do we have another question? Yes.
Hi, Alexandra.
Hello.
So a question about diversity. Does Bloomsbury Publishing, your organization, have a diversity quota each year, annually, maybe in the genre of South Asian literature in English?
We don't have a quota because we have always published internationally in a way that I don't think any other British company has done, and it is something I'm very proud of. My predecessor as editor-in-chief was Liz Calder, and she published Michael Ondaatje, Adaf Suef, who is here at the festival, and she came from New Zealand. She was always very outward-facing, and then when I joined in 1999, that was just the natural thing that I did. And I think partly because of my mother's background and also because my father used to go to West Africa to teach every year, and he brought me back Achebe's Things Fall Apart when I was 14, and it changed everything for me. So we have always had a high quota. But what has happened is that British publishers in general are now very, very alert to it. And it's quite interesting for me watching people fall over themselves. I think it is only a good thing. I think it's incredibly important. But it's not just what you publish. It's more, I think, the makeup of publishing houses, because publishing houses in Britain, particularly, and in America, have been very white and middle class. And I think that changing your staff is going to change everything, more than having a completely white middle class set of editors and people who make decisions thinking, oh, I have to publish with diversity. So that's going to be a slow process, and I think it will take 10 years for it to start to show, and I think people are attending to it now. And you have to be ready to hire from unusual places and to train people up. And editors tend to start really, as I did, as an assistant. So you don't start having power in publishing for at least 10 years in your publishing life, 5 years minimum. So it'll be 10, 20 years until we can see the change, but that change has to happen.
So just a quick question, specifically in the genre of South Asian writing in English, not South Asians living in the UK, but South Asians who don't live in the UK, specifically in that genre, could you pinpoint 2 or 3 books which you felt recently, in the past couple of years, were real shining stars of Bloomsbury Productions?
Things absolutely flee out of your head the minute that you. We published Mira Sethi's stories last year, and for me, that was an absolutely wonderful thing, because she was writing in a voice that was quite new. And she was writing about the sort of with subtlety. She's got her book launch actually in 5 minutes, so I mustn't be late because I have to introduce it. But that is like, it was like finding Jane Austen in Lahore, and that was very, very exciting for me. Sorry, this must be the last because I mustn't be late. I don't know about the agents but I do know of agents in Britain who are particularly interested in South Asian writing. For example, there's one called David Godwin, who is has been the agent of people like Arundhati Roy and Vikram Seth, but he's still always finding new young voices.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. This was a brilliant session.
I'm sorry to have to flee.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much everybody who's asked such incredible questions.
Yes, thank you.
And insightful questions. Thank you for your time, everyone.
Thank you.